Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As you know, we have a really special guest. It's part of Saatchi's connection to the Advertising Educational Foundation. Saatchi has a really rich history with the AEF. In fact, Stu Upson, one of Saatchi's prior CEOs, was responsible for providing some of the seed money that created this organization that connects academia with the ad industry. So the visiting professor program is really great because it gives professors a chance to work with agencies and get in the trenches and bring that back to their classroom. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Cathy Bullock today. She's from Utah State and in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication. So I'll turn it over to her, and thank you so much for coming.
It's really good to be here with you today, and I want to start by thanking the Advertising Educational Foundation, Sharon Hudson, Sarah, their crew who brought me here and have allowed me to spend a couple of weeks studying the ad industry so that I can do a better job of going back and teaching it in my classes. Also want to thank Saatchi and Saatchi for hosting me. I was with the Ad Council last week, with Saatchi and Saatchi this week, and just really, really thrilled to be here. So thank you guys for having me. Just out of curiosity, how many of you guys are interns? I met some of you ahead of time. Okay, good. Thank you guys for being here. I know you guys are going to have a phenomenal summer here. Okay, I'd like to start with a quote coming from a newspaper down in Florida. Americans like to think of themselves as middle class even when they're not. We may be wealthy, but we got there by using middle class values of hard work. We may be poor, but we believe in our hearts that it's only temporary, that something better is around the corner. I think this quotation for me kind of encapsulates the conventional wisdom about America's middle class and the American dream. But is that thinking changing as we see the middle class shrinking, as we see Americans sort of slogging their way through what's been labeled an age of inequality, income inequality, and as questions have been coming up about whether mobility ultimately means moving down rather than moving up. So today what I want to do is just sort of briefly take a look at this idea of the shrinking middle class and this growing divide between the classes, the upper classes and the lower classes, and why economists think this matters. Then I'll take a look at whether Americans' ideas about the middle class and being middle class have been changing in response to the trends. And then finally, I just want to throw in one or two ideas about how Americans' attitudes and behavior have been changing. So let's start with, what is the middle class? Sounds like a pretty easy question, right? Any discussion of the shrinking middle class is complicated by the fact that there are so many definitions out there of middle class. We're not really sure what it is. As Horrigan and Hagan pointed out more than 25 years ago in the Monthly Labor Review, this is not a new question. You can talk about individuals, you can talk about families, you can talk about households, you can talk about wage and salary earnings, or you can talk about total income. What do we count if we're going to call ourselves middle class? You can talk about dollar amounts adjusted over time for inflation, or you can talk about being within a certain distance of the median income. Today, if you read the media, a lot of times what we see is middle class being defined as families or households with a certain, that fall within a certain range around the median. So if you take everybody's income, line it all up from lowest to highest, you start chopping off from the ends, you arrive in the middle at the one median income. So what we'll often see is in the media, defining middle class as maybe 50% of the median income up to 150% of the median income, or 75% up to 150%. Or we talk about quintiles. We take the income distribution, chop it into 5 parts. Each would be a quintile, and we say, okay, the middle is the middle class. Now, some economists sidestep, having to define the middle class and talk instead about income inequality. And what they're really doing is quantifying the share of income garnered by the wealthiest people compared to the rest of us, or compared to the poorest among us. So we have a mess. We have a little bit of a mess in terms of our definition. And as one of my mentors in grad school would say about this, I think middle class is a globby concept. So that's where we're starting. So what can we say about the middle class today? what would we maybe be safe in saying? In spite of this definitional morass that we have going on here, research on the state of the middle class, I think anyway, leads us to a handful of important conclusions. I came away with about 4 things that seem to me, even though we don't all agree completely on the definition of middle class, that maybe the economists would tend to agree with these ideas. Let me run them by you, see what you think. First of all, first big idea that I take away from this overall discussion is the idea that evidence based on income data seems to indicate that the middle class is shrinking. But not all economists, where they disagree, is they disagree on whether people are migrating up or whether people are migrating down. They're leaving the middle class, but which direction are they going? And that's where those definitions start to become important. Scott Winship of the Brookings Institution, writing in early 2012 and defining the middle class as having income between 50% of the median and 150% of the median, concluded that, yeah, the middle class is shrinking, but it's because people are going up. Here's what he said. The share of households with income that puts them in the middle class or higher was 76% in 1970 and 75% in 2010, figures that are statistically indistinguishable. But other economists might argue those statistics don't really quite tell us the story. There's really more going on. Holt and Greenwood, writing in the Journal of Economic Issues, noted that the distribution of wages, income, and wealth has become more unequal since 1980. Here's what they have to say. As economic growth flowed increasingly to the very top, that left less to be divided among lower and middle income households. Makes sense, right? They said it also created several negative externalities that diminished financial well-being for many households, even if they were among those who had increases in real income. The way I translate that for myself, since I am not a financial analyst or an economist, is this. Maybe income has gone up a little bit for me in real terms, but because of some other things going on, I'm still feeling pinched, and I'm doing worse than I was before. So that's what they're saying. Reports from the Congressional Budget Office on the distribution of household income, federal taxes, confirm that we're seeing this income growth for the people who are wealthier. Again, let me give you some statistics here. According to the report for 2010, before tax income, and we're adjusting for inflation here, grew by about 1% for the households in the bottom fifth. We're talking quintiles again here, the bottom fifth of the income distribution, so the poorest among us. Their income rose by about 1%. If you moved into the middle, their income rose less than 1%. We're talking the 3 middle fifths. And if you move up a little bit, the income rose about 5% for the households in the top fifth. If you sort of shave off the very top, just take the top 1%, their income rose by 16%. Well, that's great, right? Don't you just love statistics? Yeah, you just all love statistics. Let's let a journalist put it in something that really kind of hits home here. Lisa Worthman, writing for the Denver Post. I love the way she put it. The richest 400 individuals in our country now have more wealth than the bottom 150 million of us combined. That really kind of hits home when you put it that way. Now, the second big conclusion that I draw from this overall discussion that we're having about the income divide is that the income divide matters. It makes a difference. So it's something we really probably do need to pay attention to. I want to bring you a quote from Robert Reich. I suspect you know this name. He was a labor secretary under Clinton. He now teaches at Berkeley. Just came out with not too long ago with a documentary called Inequality for All. And what he's suggesting is this. The median wage of the bottom 90% of Americans is lower today than it was 3 decades ago. We're adjusting for inflation, even though the economy is twice as large. And he goes on to say, as a result, the middle class doesn't have the buying power necessary for buoyant growth. Think about that. Doesn't have the buying power necessary for buoyant growth. Well, what economists are telling us is the fact that we have this income divide and we have this sort of shrinking middle made it more difficult for us to come out of the recession of the 2000s, and that's been important to all of us, particularly you guys coming out of college. You want to go out and get jobs. It's making a difference to you. This income divide has helped contributed to decreased consumer spending, annual consumer spending. I've seen some figures that put that in the hundreds of millions of dollars of decrease. Increased consumer debt. We maintain our middle class lifestyle by going into debt. Problems with housing affordability, with access to public goods and services, good schools for our kids. Some suggest that the increasing income divide basically leads to greater political inequality, with the political power being concentrated in the hands of the more wealthy people. And of course, that would have ramifications for us as a democratic society. So in short, again, if we want to translate all this gobbledygook from the economists, here's what I take away from it. If we don't have a large, healthy middle class, if too many of us are migrating down the economic ladder, then there aren't enough of us to consume all those goods and products and use those services and keep the economy healthy. Now, you may say, well, a wealthy American has lots of money, can buy lots of stuff, but there are some things you just don't need that many of. One example Reich gave is a pillow, a bed pillow. How many of those do you need? You can be a wealthy person. You can afford to buy 1 million of them. Do you need 1 million of them? No. What the economy needs is 100 of us, or 1,000 of us, or 10,000 of us, or 100,000 of us who can all go out and buy our own individual bed pillow. Okay, well, maybe this income divide maybe would be a less serious concern if the current situation was just seen as sort of a temporary little blip because of the Great Recession, right? We're coming out of that. You know, why worry so much about it if we're already, out of the recession? However, a third conclusion that I take away from sort of this overall discussion that's going on is that the inequality problem predated the Great Recession. The shrinking middle class decline, the income inequality problem was there before the recession, the most recent recession, and these things probably are not going to go away just because the recession is behind us. The recession may ease, but the problems are still going to be there. Writing in the journal Social Research, a man named Howell traced the roots of the current situation to the laissez-faire experiment back in the 1980s. And economists basically say there are a whole variety of factors that are coming together that predated that recession that aren't expected to go away, that have been helping to create this situation. Writing a decade ago, so this is not a new issue, not a new discussion, not a new question. They were writing in a Brookings-Wharton paper on urban affairs, said this: as others have noted, the post-1970 economy generally produced a shrinking middle class, an expanding share of affluent families, and a persistent population of poor individuals and households. The reason for this shift are varied. Technological change, globalization of factor markets, changing tax policies, aging of the population, immigration. So if you look at these trends, they're not going away. So, in short, the income inequality problem isn't really expected to dissipate just because the recession is behind us. Fourth major conclusion I take away. I think, based on my reading of the overall discussion, is that it's really not reasonable anymore to assume that our conventional wisdom about mobility still holds, that it's still valid. We're talking about the American dream here. We're talking about the idea that every American who's willing to work hard has a chance to climb that economic ladder and do better than their parents did. Going back to our quote from the beginning, we want to believe that we all have that chance for upward mobility, right? But there was an interesting study done by Harvard and Berkeley economists, and they concluded that, listen to this one, economic mobility hasn't changed much since the 1950s. Now, we all assume it's going down, right? They're saying, no, it hasn't gone down, it just hasn't changed much. That sounds like really great news, right? We should be happy about that. But the kicker, the really sticky point, is that it wasn't that good to begin with. So we're starting low, and we're staying low. So the last 30 or 40 years, we've had relatively low mobility. Your ability to move up, not that great. We've stayed there. And this is a fact that applies to the poor in particular, but also applies to the middle class. So it's not just the lowest rungs. Now, this doesn't mean we don't move from one social class to another. Economists talk about what I would kind of define as churn. People, because of changing life situations, you move up or you move down temporarily. You sort of bounce around a little bit. For example, you take on a second job, you're earning more income, or your company cuts your hours at work, or you have a chance to earn a lot of overtime pay, or you temporarily have an illness that means you're out of work for a while. You plan to get back into the workforce, but your income's adjusting. So you move up or down a little bit. This is going on all the time, and it happens to most of us sometime during our lifetime. But that's not really what the Harvard and the Berkeley people are talking about. They're talking about longer term. They're talking about 70% of the people who start in the bottom fifth never make it up into the middle class. And only 20% of those who start in the middle fifth make it to the top fifth. They're talking low mobility is what they're talking about. So what are we saying here? We have a middle class that appears to be shrinking. We have a higher level of income inequality. And these things make a difference in the strength of our economy, strength of our society. These trends predated the Great Recession, means they're with us. They're probably going to continue. We have some mobility problems. Those have been with us. We haven't always been aware of it, but we've had these for years. Okay. So you're glad you had pizza, right? I'm telling you all this depressing stuff, so you're glad you at least had lunch. Okay, but so what? This is what I always tell my students. You have to ask the so what question. You can't just sit here with all these yucky statistics. Ask so what. Surely we don't live with these kinds of trends and remain unaffected by them. So, how have our ideas about what it means to be middle class changed? Surely these trends have had some effect on us, right? Have our ideas about whether we're middle class changed? Research suggests that the answers to both of these is yes. First, do we still think we're middle class? American Demographic article from almost 20 years ago now, as I say, this is not a new discussion, noted that being middle class is a state of mind shared by nearly all Americans. And what the author was saying is this: whether you're middle class or not, just say you are. If you're more affluent, you know that there are people out there who don't like that. You're affluent, they're not, there's some envy there. So they will sometimes claim to be middle class. They kind of avoid that whole mess, right? Then you have the people who really are middle class, the people who maybe in the past would have said proudly, I'm working class, maybe have shifted away from labeling themselves in that way to the more fashionable middle class. So people would claim a middle class status and middle class values, middle class lifestyle, even if it didn't really necessarily apply to them. There's some evidence that this is changing, that this has changed. And here I'm going to draw heavily on data from the Pew Research Center. If you're familiar with that, you know they ask all kinds of wonderful questions, get all kinds of amazing answers. So I'm drawing heavily on Pew data here. This is from 2012. Do we still think we're middle class? Basically what Pew found when they asked this question, again 2012, is that 49% of the respondents said, I'm middle class. That was 2012. That's down from 53% just 4 years earlier. 17% said, I am upper middle class or upper class. That was down from 21% 4 years earlier. 32% said, I'm lower middle class or lower class. They tend to say lower middle, not labeling themselves lower class. That's up from 25% 4 years earlier. Now, the thing I find really interesting about this is not the Pew Center forcing some artificial definition of middle class on us. This is respondents being able to label themselves, to say, I am middle class, I am upper middle class, I am lower middle class. This is people saying, this is how I see myself, okay? So I think that's really kind of fascinating. What we're seeing is fewer people saying, smaller proportion of people saying, I'm middle class, and smaller proportion of people saying, I'm upper middle class or upper, and more people saying, I'm down toward the bottom. I didn't really take a real close look at parsing it out, who's where, but the Pew researchers, when they took a closer look at the lower class demographic, they found a growing share there of people who were under 30, so young people, and growing shares among Hispanics and whites. So just so you know. So what are we saying here? What are we really saying? Again, from a journalist, I like the way Cox summed this up. What used to be the case, Americans defined themselves as middle class, even if they weren't, is starting to adjust to sad reality. Americans don't think of themselves as middle class because they're not. Now, according to some Pew data, we're also questioning this idea of upward mobility. That's such an important part of the American dream and such an important part of our kind of our social psyche. About 3/4 of the people Pew surveyed who say they are lower middle or lower class say it's harder to get ahead now than it was a decade ago. Just over half of those in the lower middle or lower categories say hard work brings success. So about half are saying, yes, if I work hard, I can be successful, compared to 2/3 of the people who see themselves as middle class and 71% of the people who see themselves as upper middle or upper class. So we're still, you look at this and you're thinking, I'm thinking, well, we're still seeing a pretty good amount of optimism in the middle class and above, right? Not so much in the lower class. But that's a little bit misleading because optimism in general is down, if you look at the stats. In 2012, 68% of the public overall agreed that hard work pays off. That was down from a peak of 74% who thought back in 1999 that hard work paid off. So a little bit of the shine is off that. We're a little bit less optimistic than we've been in the past. Pew Research also indicated that about 85% of self-described middle-class adults say it's more difficult than it was a decade ago to maintain a middle-class standard of living. You want to know what's really interesting? You want to know who they blame? Yeah, right? Who's to blame? 62% said a lot of the blame lies with Congress. We always blame Congress, right? No surprise there. 54%, hey, a lot of the blame goes to the banks and the financial institutions, 47% large corporations, and if you're working for a Walmart or a General Mills, you might be interested in that. 44% the Bush administration, the big, bad, evil Bush administration. 39% foreign competition, if you're working for somebody who's outsourcing jobs and so on, that might be of interest to you. 34% the Obama administration, the big, bad, evil Obama administration. And we don't blame ourselves very much, just 8% saying, hey, well, guess what? The fault lies with the middle class itself. So I think this really is interesting to you if you're working with one of the big corporations, if you're working with a bank or a financial institution. And if you look at it, there was a lot of blame around. If you add these statistics up, a lot of people were saying a lot of the blame rests with boom, 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 going right on down the list. So what are we saying? We're saying that a larger proportion of Americans they see themselves as lower middle or lower class. This group also has serious questions about whether they're able to advance, whether they're able to get ahead. Smaller proportions of us see ourselves as middle class or upper class, and overall we're not quite as optimistic as we were about this idea that, yes, if I work hard, I can get ahead. Also, our views of what it takes to consider ourselves middle class or what being middle class means, these appear to have shifted. I just want to offer a couple of ideas about this. So what's considered essential to being middle class? And I'm going back into the Pew Center data again for this. Pew asked American adults what a person needs to be considered middle class. Do you need to own a house? Do you need to own stocks? What do you have to have? A college education? What makes you, what's essential to a middle class lifestyle? Anybody want to take a guess? Guess for me. Car? Okay. Okay, ownership of a house or property. Okay. There you go. Jobs. 86% said a secure job is what you need to feel that you are middle class. And interesting, I think this is fascinating, right below that, not right below it, but the next one, number 2, health insurance, which is often tied to our job. So being able to have a job, a secure job, and have health insurance. Those were, by far the top 2. After that, then we start getting down into home ownership. That was still important. A college education. We're down, only a little over 1/3 of the people were saying that, and financial investments. So we kind of moved on down from there. So a secure job was far and away what people said, that's essential to a middle class lifestyle and to being able to feel I'm middle class. And then health insurance below that. Now, Pew suggests that this has changed over time. And they're basing that on results from a 1991 Time/CNN study. And that study had showed 7 out of 10 people, so 70% roughly, ranking homeownership as essential, and only a third saying having a white-collar job as essential. Now, Pew warns us, and they're right, that we can't really make a direct comparison because the question wording was different, so take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. One more idea, though, about what it means to be middle class. Writing in the National Journal last year, Amy Sullivan suggested that being middle class has always meant 2 separate things. First of all, it means affluence. You have a solid income. Second, it means security. You're able to maintain your quality of life from year to year. And she goes on to say that for the first few decades after World War II, we were able to look at both of those as the same thing, affluence and security, that they, one came with the other. It was sort of synonymous. We had low divorce rates. People, in some cases, would work for one company their entire career. So you had, if not lifelong employment, at least longer-term employment. Good benefits came with that. We had things in place that were sort of protecting us from life's ups and downs. But that assumption that security equals, the affluence and security are the same thing began to change back in the 70s. Today, research indicates that what Americans are really interested in is the security piece of this, holding on to what we have. That we're more interested in that today than we are in trying to increase our income. The Pew Economic Mobility Project asked Americans back in 2011, would you rather have financial stability? Would you rather move up the income ladder? 85% chose financial stability. Of course, we'd like both of them, right? But if you have to choose, today Americans are really interested in that idea of security and stability. I have to share what I think is kind of a fun example from the Pew Mobility Project. They put people in focus groups, right? And people in the focus groups would be asked to draw a sketch of what the American dream means to them. Now stop and think about it for a minute. How would you draw the American dream? What would you put in it? What most people put in it, and have for a number of years, is a couple of adults, 2 adults, some kids, a dog, a house with a fence. And the thing that I think is just wonderful and bizarre at the same time is that the researchers said even the cat owners put a dog in the picture. I'm thinking that is so strange. As a lover of cats and as one who has a very spoiled cat at home, I would be drawing my cat. There would be no dog in my picture, there would be a cat. But a lot of people, it's got to be a dog. Well, when the researchers dug in, and this hasn't changed, this is what the picture looks like for us. People have been drawing this picture for a long time now. But when the researchers dug in and said, okay, explain these symbols to me, the fence, the house, the dog, explain these things to me, it was all about security. It was being able to afford a home. It was being able to have, a healthy family living in a safe neighborhood. The dog, the symbolism behind the dog was, if you can cover your basic needs and have a little bit left over, you can afford a pet. So you could have that dog or that cat or that rabbit in the picture. So when they really sort of distilled it, what they found was, and I'm quoting from the Pew researchers, it became clear that for the individuals we spoke to, the American dream was much more about feeling they could sleep well at night than about getting ahead. Well, I think these shifts, whether we really are middle class, whether we think we're middle class, what we think it takes to be considered middle class, what we think the American dream means, I think they have great potential. These shifts have great potential to shape what you guys are doing in the advertising industry. But just for good measure, let me throw in just 1 or 2 quick final thoughts about how people who may or may not still be in the middle class have been changing their behavior in response to all this stuff we've been talking about. So how are Americans changing their behavior? Again, going back to Pew, because Pew asks people all kinds of fun stuff. And in one survey, now this survey was about 5 years ago, okay? Pew specifically asked people, what steps have you been taking to tighten your belt so that you can make it through these hard times? And I still bring you this information because I think it's still relevant, and I think, because we know the trends are continuing, And because I think some of these things we're talking about had the potential to turn into lifelong habits, as opposed to, oh, I'll just do it for now. So what Pew did is they gave people a list of 9 things, and they said, have you been doing this, have you been doing this? And then they gave people a chance to volunteer their own answers to how have you been tightening your belt. Here's what they came up with. 57% of the people they surveyed were buying less expensive brands or shopping more at discount stores. 28% cut back their spending on alcohol and cigarettes. 24% reduced or canceled cable and satellite TV subscriptions. 22% they changed to a less expensive cell phone plan or even canceled their cell phone. And I thought, wow, this was back in 2009, and even for 2009, 1 out of 5, more than 1 out of 5, potentially moving to a less expensive plan or canceling their plan. That still surprised me a little bit. 20% say, okay, we're doing our own yard work now. We're, oh, did I skip vegetable garden? 21% made plans to plant a vegetable garden, and I think I would love to know if anybody really did that, if they're still doing it, because I grew up in a family that did a lot of gardening, and to do a garden well and really get anything out of it takes a lot of work. I'm thinking people probably tried it for a year. They gave up on that. They're buying the canned vegetables again. That's my guess anyway. If you ever find out, email me and let me know. Okay, 20% started doing their own yard work or home repairs, so now we have an unemployed yard work person or home repair person. 16% held a garage sale or sold things on the internet. 10%, listen to this, 1 out of 10, had a friend or relative move in to save costs or moved in with a friend or relative. 2% rented out a room or space in their home to a boarder. Now, great, right? These figures are even more impressive when you think that these are based on the full sample. So this includes, take the cigarette and alcohol category. The percentage who said, yeah, I decreased my alcohol consumption. This includes even the people who don't drink, who are never going to say I'm decreasing my alcohol consumption because they didn't drink in the first place. So if you took those people out of it and just said, okay, out of the smokers and drinkers, out of the people who did used to hire somebody to do their yard work, whatever, if you just looked at the percentages of those folks, these numbers would be a lot higher and even more impressive. Now, Pew then, as we said, also asked people to volunteer. How else are you tightening your belt? And people came up with a couple of other things. They were eating out less often, and they were saving money on gas by cutting back on driving, consolidating trips, whatever. Now, going back to this idea of saving money by moving in with a friend or a relative or having somebody move in with you, we're definitely seeing changes in household makeup. We've seen a rise in multi-generational households, so adult children moving back in with parents, or grandparents with grandchildren living with them, or grandparents having primary responsibility for caring for grandchildren. And that, I can't help but wonder what that ultimately is going to mean, for that grandparent. If the grandparent's still the one doing the weekly shopping, is that cart now has, diapers in it next to the arthritis medicine? I'm wondering, what does that mean for the weekly shopping? So where does this leave us? Back to our quote from the beginning. Maybe we do like to think of ourselves as middle class, and maybe we do want to believe that we can be upwardly mobile, but in today's environment, it's getting harder and harder to hold on to those ideas, getting more and more difficult. And we're definitely seeing some behavioral changes that are going along with that. Thank you very much for listening when you could have been staring out at the beautiful view, and I would hope to get kind of a conversation going now. What do you think about all this? Thank you.